I'm David Keller. I'm in my late 50s, and I watched my own son smile at me while signing papers that sold my house. I didn't know that's what they were at the time. Jason told me it was cleanup. He said California paperwork was messy, that refinancing things would make retirement easier, that he was just helping me straighten things out before I got older. He said all this while sitting across from me at the kitchen table I'd paid off 15 years earlier. I trusted him. He's my son. You don't expect to need defenses inside your own family. What I didn't know was that while he was talking about helping me stay comfortable, my name was already being used in places I'd never been, accounts I didn't recognize, documents I didn't remember signing, decisions I definitely hadn't agreed to. The house wasn't the first thing he took. It was just the first thing I could see. The moment everything cracked wasn't dramatic. It was a phone call from a bank employee who sounded confused when she asked me why I was applying for something I'd never requested. When I told her I hadn't, she paused and said, "Sir, your son already signed." That was the first time I felt real fear, not anger, fear. Because somewhere between trusting my son and trying to enjoy retirement, my life had been reorganized without me. And Jason knew exactly what he was doing the entire time. The paperwork started long before I noticed anything was wrong. Jason had been coming by more often after my wife passed. He'd bring groceries I didn't ask for, insist on fixing things around the house that weren't broken, sit with me while I sorted mail, and make jokes about how confusing everything looked once you hit a certain age. He never said I was incapable. He didn't have to. He just made sure the idea stayed nearby. "California's brutal with this stuff," he'd say, flipping through envelopes. "One missed form and they freeze accounts. I see it all the time." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. He worked in finance. He spoke with confidence. And I was tired. Tired in the quiet way that comes after you've spent decades being responsible and suddenly no one's leaning on you anymore. He suggested I give him limited authority to help streamline things. Just temporary. Just in case. Power of attorney, but only for paperwork. He said it would make sure nothing slipped through the cracks if I got sick or missed a deadline. I hesitated. He laughed it off. "Dad, this is standard. I'm not taking anything from you. I'm protecting you." So I signed. After that, the tone shifted, subtly. Jason stopped asking permission and started informing me. He'd tell me he handled something for me already, that he talked to the bank, that he spoke to an advisor I didn't remember authorizing. Whenever I looked confused, he'd slow his voice down and repeat himself, like you do with someone who's struggling to keep up. "You don't remember? We talked about this last week." Sometimes I wasn't sure if we had. That scared me more than I wanted to admit. He started recording our conversations, said it was so he wouldn't forget details later. I didn't love it, but I didn't fight it either. I didn't realize he wasn't recording for memory. He was collecting evidence. Around that time, bills started arriving that didn't make sense. Statements I'd never seen before. When I asked Jason about them, he brushed it off. Said they were interim documents. Said I didn't need to worry. "Trust me," he told me. "I've got this." The house felt different too, not physically, emotionally. Jason talked about it like an asset instead of a home. He mentioned equity more than memories. Asked if I'd ever thought about downsizing, about freeing up cash, about how much easier things would be without maintenance. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. He smiled and said, "Of course not." That was when I should have pushed back, asked more questions, called someone else. But when your own son is the one reassuring you, doubt doesn't feel like wisdom. It feels like paranoia, and I didn't want to believe that about my own child. By the time I realized Jason wasn't just helping me manage my life, but quietly taking control of it, the foundation was already shifting under my feet. I just didn't know yet how much of it was already gone. The first real warning sign didn't come from Jason. It came from how other people started talking to me. A teller at my bank asked if I'd decided to change strategies. A financial advisor I'd worked with for years suddenly insisted on speaking to my son instead of me. When I pushed back, he looked uncomfortable and said Jason told him I preferred it that way. That was the first time I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked Jason about it that night. He didn't deny anything. He sighed, rubbed his face, and said he was just trying to make things easier for me. "You've been forgetting stuff, Dad," he said gently. "I didn't want to stress you out." I told him I wasn't forgetting. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like someone humoring a difficult patient. That hurt more than if he'd yelled. After that, the gaslighting got sharper. He'd bring up conversations I didn't remember and act concerned when I couldn't recall details. He'd say things like, We talked about this twice, or you were really clear about it at the time. And every time I questioned him, he'd look almost sad. Do you want me to start writing things down for you? He asked once. Just so you don't feel embarrassed later. I agreed, even though my stomach twisted when I did. Not long after, the retirement statements stopped coming to my house. Jason said he switched them to paperless because it was safer. When I asked to see them, he showed me screenshots instead of originals. Numbers that looked right at a glance but didn't sit right when I thought about them longer. Whenever I asked too many questions, he reminded me how much stress I'd been under, how Mom's death had taken a toll, how people my age sometimes needed help, even if they didn't want to admit it. He never raised his voice. He never threatened me. He just made it sound reasonable that I shouldn't be in charge anymore. The moment I knew something was truly wrong came during a routine checkup. The doctor asked if I'd noticed any memory issues. I said no. Then he mentioned Jason had emailed him concerns. Concerns. That word followed me home like a shadow. Jason admitted he'd reached out just to be safe. Said it was better to document things early than regret it later. I felt exposed in a way I didn't have words for. Like my own mind had been put on trial without me present. That night, I lay awake in the house I thought was still mine, listening to the familiar sounds, trying to reassure myself that I wasn't losing control. But the truth was harder to admit. I wasn't losing it all at once. I was being convinced, slowly, deliberately, that I already had. The proof didn't arrive all at once. It leaked into my life in pieces, the way bad truths usually do. The first piece came in the mail. It was a letter from a lender I'd never heard of, thanking me for my continued business and reminding me of an upcoming payment tied to my property. I read it 3 times before it made sense. I hadn't taken out a new loan. The house was paid off, had been for years. When I called the number on the letter, the woman on the line asked me to verify my identity. Then she thanked me and said she'd need to speak with my authorized representative. I told her I was the homeowner. There was a pause. "Sir," she said carefully, "your son has power of attorney on file. He's been handling this account." I hung up without saying anything else. That evening, I asked Jason directly what loan she was talking about. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look guilty. He looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted him in the middle of something important. "It's just a refinance," he said. "Temporary. I told you about this." I told him he hadn't. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Dad, we went over this. You were worried about future medical costs. This gives you flexibility." Something in his tone changed then, less gentle, more firm. "You agreed." That was when I understood what he'd been doing with those recordings. Every conversation, every moment I hesitated or trailed off. He wasn't worried about my memory. He was building his case. Over the next week, I started noticing how much had already been decided without me. The retirement account I'd contributed to for decades had been restructured. Jason said it was still mine, just held differently. When I asked for statements, he told me not to obsess. "You're going to drive yourself crazy," he said. "Let me handle it." I tried calling the retirement company myself. They wouldn't speak to me without Jason present. That night, I searched my own name online, something I'd never done before. Buried in public records was a filing I didn't recognize, my address, my signature, or something that looked like it. A deed of trust. I sat at the kitchen table until well after midnight, staring at the screen, realizing the ground under me had already shifted. The house hadn't been sold yet, but it had been hollowed out. Every dollar of equity I'd built over 40 years was already spoken for. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the calm certainty settling in that Jason hadn't panicked and crossed a line. He'd planned this. When I confronted him the next morning, he didn't deny it. He told me I was overreacting, said everything was legal, said I should be grateful he was thinking ahead instead of leaving me vulnerable. "You don't need to worry about owning things anymore," he said. "I've got it covered." That was the moment the fear turned into something else. Because I realized he wasn't just trying to control my finances. He was positioning himself to decide where I lived, and how much of my own life I was allowed to keep. And he was doing it with a straight face, in the house I still believed was mine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I didn't tell him what I was about to do. I just stopped trusting a single word he said. And once that happens, you start looking for the truth in places other people forget to hide it. I didn't confront Jason again after that, not right away. That was the hardest part, pretending I still believed him while my stomach stayed tight all day. I let him keep talking. Let him keep explaining things I knew weren't true. Let him think his version of reality had settled in for good. He mistook my silence for surrender. I started writing things down instead: dates, phone calls, names of people who suddenly wouldn't speak to me without Jason present. Every time he said, "We talked about this," I noted when we hadn't. Every time he told someone I was confused, I paid attention to who heard it. I noticed how often he framed my questions as symptoms. "See," he'd say to other people, not to me. "This is what I'm dealing with." Once I caught him replaying one of those recordings. He stopped when he saw me and smiled like nothing was wrong. "Just making sure I don't miss anything," he said. I nodded and walked away, my hands shaking. The house started feeling less like shelter and more like leverage. Jason brought up selling it casually now, like the decision had already been made. He talked about timing, about market conditions, about how much easier it would be for me in a smaller place. When I said I didn't want to sell, he didn't argue. He just said, "We'll see." That night, I called the county recorder's office myself. It took longer than I expected. I had to answer questions, prove who I was, explain why I was calling. When the clerk finally pulled up the file, her voice changed. She didn't say I no longer owned the house. She said it was encumbered, multiple liens, recent, all signed under power of attorney. I thanked her and hung up, sitting in the dark with the phone still in my hand. Jason hadn't sold the house yet. He'd made sure I couldn't stop him when he did. The next morning, I went to a public library instead of staying home. I didn't want Jason listening. I looked up elder law attorneys in California and called one, then another. I didn't say my son stole from me. I just described what had happened and asked what my options were. The second attorney went quiet halfway through. When he spoke again, he didn't ask about my memory. He didn't ask about my health. He asked if I could come in that afternoon. Sitting across from him, I finally said it out loud. "I think my son is preparing to take everything." He didn't look surprised. He told me something that stuck with me. "People who do this don't stop on their own," he said. "They stop when the control breaks." I walked out of that office knowing two things. First, Jason had crossed lines he thought I was too weak to notice. Second, if I waited much longer, he'd make decisions for me that I could never undo. And for the first time since this started, the fear didn't paralyze me, it focused me. The lawyer didn't promise to fix everything, he promised something else. He said we could slow it down. That alone felt like oxygen. He explained what Jason had done in plain terms, not emotionally, not judgmentally, just facts. Abuse of power of attorney, breach of fiduciary duty, financial manipulation that looked clean on the surface and rotten underneath. "The longer this goes on," he said, "the harder it is to unwind. But it's not too late yet." Yet mattered. He told me not to confront Jason again, not to tip him off, not to try to regain control directly. He said people who do this don't panic when challenged. They panic when they realize the system isn't on their side anymore. So I went home and played the part Jason expected. I let him talk about selling the house like it was already decided. I nodded when he mentioned listing timelines. I didn't argue when he said I'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, closer to him. That part almost made me laugh. Behind the scenes, the lawyer started requesting records. Not from Jason, from institutions, retirement administrators, banks, lenders. He asked for copies of everything signed under the power of attorney. And the picture that came back was worse than I thought. My retirement hadn't just been moved. It had been rerouted into an account that technically still bore my name, but required Jason's approval for every transaction. The money was there, but unreachable, controlled. The house equity had been stripped in stages. Not one big refinance, several smaller ones timed carefully. Each one defensible on its own. Together, they emptied 40 years of work into obligations I'd never agreed to. When the lawyer laid it all out in front of me, I felt something I hadn't felt since my wife died. Anger. Not explosive, not loud, focused. Jason started pressing harder around the same time. He asked why I'd been leaving the house more, why I was making calls he wasn't on. He reminded me, gently at first, that everything was easier when we worked together. "You don't need to get lawyers involved," he said. "That just makes things messy." I looked him in the eye and said, "I'm just trying to understand my situation." He watched me closely after that. The lawyer filed the first motion without telling Jason, a request to suspend the power of attorney pending review. It didn't accuse him of a crime, it just questioned the pattern. Jason found out 2 days later. He called me immediately, not angry, not yet. "Why are people asking questions?" he said. "Did you talk to someone?" I didn't lie. I needed clarity, I said. There was a pause on the line, a long one. Then his voice changed. This time it wasn't gentle. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't understand how bad this could get." I let him finish. Then I said something I hadn't said in months. "I understand more than you think." That was the moment I felt the balance shift. Not because I'd won anything yet, but because Jason finally realized I wasn't confused anymore, and confusion had been his greatest weapon. Once the court suspended the power of attorney, Jason stopped pretending. The calls started coming in waves, missed calls, voicemails left half-finished, texts that bounced between concern and irritation. He wanted to know what I'd told the lawyer, what I'd shared, whether I'd said anything that couldn't be walked back. I didn't answer. The silence bothered him more than any accusation could have. Within days, the effect showed. Accounts Jason used to move through freely were suddenly locked pending review. A lender called him asking for clarification he couldn't give without me. The retirement administrator requested written confirmation from me before processing anything else. Jason showed up at the house that afternoon without calling first. He didn't sit down. He paced. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "People are misunderstanding things." I asked him what things. He snapped back that he was just trying to protect me, that everything he'd done was legal, that lawyers were going to twist the situation and make him look bad. I waited until he ran out of breath. Then I said calmly, "If it's all fine, you won't have anything to worry about." He stopped pacing. For the first time, I saw real fear flicker across his face. The lawyer moved fast after that. He filed for a full accounting of every transaction Jason had authorized. Not selectively, not partially, everything. Each refinance, each retirement transfer. Each recording Jason had leaned on to establish concern. Jason tried to delay. He claimed paperwork was missing, that records were archived, that it would take time, the judge didn't care. Deadlines were set. That's when Jason started losing control in places he couldn't hide. His employer called him into a meeting, not because of the case itself, but because wage garnishment notices had been preliminarily flagged in anticipation of judgment. HR wanted to know if there was something they needed to prepare for. Jason called me after that meeting, his voice tight. "You didn't have to go this far," he said. "We're family." I didn't raise my voice. "You made this not about family," I said. "You made it about paperwork." The next hearing was the one that broke him. The court-appointed accountant walked through the numbers slowly, methodically. No drama. Just a timeline of how my retirement had been boxed in and how the house had been stripped piece by piece. Jason tried to interrupt. The judge shut him down. When Jason's lawyer finally spoke, it was to ask for mitigation, to argue intent, to suggest everything had been done in my best interest. The judge looked at Jason and asked one question. "Did your father ever ask you to do this?" Jason didn't answer. He couldn't. The court ordered provisional restitution pending final judgment. Jason was instructed to begin repaying immediately, even before the case concluded. That was the moment the future he'd been quietly counting on collapsed. After the hearing, Jason followed me into the hallway. His voice dropped. His hands were shaking. "Please," he said, "just tell them you misunderstood." I looked at him and spoke clearly enough that he'd remember it. "You planned my life without me," I said. "I'm just taking it back." He stepped away like I'd struck him. The fear on his face wasn't about money anymore. It was about time, because he finally understood something he should have known from the beginning. Courts don't forget. Records don't forget. And neither do fathers who trusted the wrong person. And the closer the final judgment got, the less room Jason had to run. The final hearing was scheduled 6 weeks out, but Jason didn't last 6 days. Once the provisional restitution order hit, his life started collapsing in places he hadn't planned for. The bank accounts he'd been using to float himself went dry fast. The retirement funds he'd treated like a private line of credit were no longer touchable. Every paycheck he earned had a percentage earmarked before it ever reached him. That kind of pressure does something to people like Jason. He stopped calling and started showing up. First at the house, my house, where he stood on the porch like he still belonged there. When I didn't answer, he waited. When I still didn't answer, he left notes. Not apologies, explanations. Long, rambling justifications about how none of this was supposed to go this far. Then he tried a different angle. He started contacting relatives. My sister called me one evening, hesitant, asking what was going on. Jason had told her I was confused, that lawyers were manipulating me, that I was destroying my relationship with my own son over paperwork misunderstandings. I told her the truth. I sent her copies of filings, timelines, numbers. I didn't editorialize. She didn't call back after that. Jason ran out of people willing to speak for him faster than he expected. The next time he reached me, it was different. He didn't open with anger or panic. He opened with familiarity. "Dad," he said quietly over the phone, "you don't want to die like this." I didn't interrupt. He talked about forgiveness, about moving on, about how ugly court records would look, about how this would follow him forever. "That's not what you want," he said. "I know you." I waited until he finished. Then I said, "You're right. I know what I want." He went silent. "I want you to be afraid every time you open your mail," I continued. "The way I was when I found out I didn't own my own house anymore." He started to speak. I cut him off. "You recorded me because you thought I was weak," I said. "Now listen carefully." My voice didn't shake. "You don't get to negotiate with me anymore. You had that chance. You used it to steal." He showed up outside the courthouse on the day of the hearing, looking smaller than I remembered. Thinner. His confidence had evaporated under the weight of consequences that didn't care about intentions. Inside, the judge didn't ask Jason how he felt. She asked him to confirm the numbers. The restitution amount was read into the record, the repayment schedule, the enforcement mechanisms, wage garnishment if he missed payments, liens if he tried to move assets, interest if he delayed. Jason's lawyer whispered something to him. Jason shook his head and looked at me. That was when he finally broke. He asked the court for leniency, not because he'd misunderstood anything, but because the burden was too heavy. He said he wouldn't survive it. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You should have thought about that before you took control of something that wasn't yours." The gavel came down softly. That sound ended the version of his life he'd been planning. In the hallway afterward, Jason caught up to me one last time. "Please," he said, "just tell me this ends." I stopped walking and looked at him. "It ends when you finish paying back what you took," I said, "and even then, the record stays." He stepped back, eyes wide. That was the first time I saw it clearly. Not regret, fear. The kind that doesn't fade, the kind that follows you home. Jason didn't come near me after that. He didn't need to. The system did the work for him. The wage garnishment started quietly. A percentage of every paycheck gone before he ever saw it. When he missed a payment, the penalties stacked automatically. Interest, notices, deadlines that didn't care how overwhelmed he felt. He tried to change jobs. The judgment followed him. He tried to rent somewhere cheaper. The lien showed up. He tried to explain it away. The paperwork said otherwise. The house stayed in my name. The liens were unwound. It took time, signatures, and patience, but the foundation held. The place felt like mine again, not because it had never left, but because I had fought to take it back. Jason never apologized, not really. The closest he came was a text months later that said, "I hope you're okay." I didn't respond. I didn't need closure from him. I had clarity. I sleep better now. Not because everything is easy, but because nothing is hidden anymore. My finances are simple. My world is smaller, safer. People sometimes ask if it hurts to lose a son like that. I tell them the truth. I didn't lose him. I saw him clearly, and once you see someone clearly, you stop protecting the version of them that never existed. Jason lives with what he did every day, every envelope he opens, every deduction on his pay stub, every door that closes a little slower than it should. As for me, I sit in my house in California, the one I built my life in, and I drink my coffee in the morning without fear. That's not revenge. That's peace. And it cost him everything he tried to take from me.